The Key by Eugene Mathena. By using this key and saying a date, you will enter through a gate. If you lose it on your way, there you will be, and there you will stay. I was awakened this morning by the sound of a pounding hammer. It was Cooper. He's my next-door neighbor. Everybody calls him Coop for short. I thought to myself while laying there on my bed, Coop must be building that shed I've heard him mention, and of all days it's when I'm sleeping the best. Coop is also the neighborhood bully, and he has been known to kill people's pets. I have caught him hitting on my dog Samson with a stick a couple of times, and we have had our share of arguments over this fact. He is also the only grown man I have ever known that enjoys playing with fire. I've warned him, the day you catch my house on fire, you're going to answer for it. He is a little older than me, and I don't think he has ever been married. He has a woman come by about once a week that I've heard him call Alice, but I think she is just there to wash his clothes and tidy the house up some. Coop and I don't have a lot in common other than we both are movie buffs. Every so often Coop and I will quiz each other on movie facts. Samson is fast asleep and snoring with his nose in my ear. I move around a bit and get to my feet. I ask him if he wants to go outside to use the bathroom. I let him out, going to the window every bit to check on him because I don't trust Coop. He's not normal, that's for sure. I fix a cup of coffee and step outside to be with Samson, and Coop is yelling about how Samson gets his business in his yard. I remind Coop that as long as Samson does his business on his side of the fence, everything is okay. His reply, his business also goes through the fence into my yard. I think he's being ridiculous about Samson's bathroom habits. I had to think of a reason to get away from Coop before I lose my composure, and since it was a beautiful spring day, I asked Samson if he would like to go to the park. He liked the idea a lot, and so we ate a bite and left for the park in my car. There was beauty in the air that day. The spring breeze and the smell of the newly bloomed flowers were intoxicating. I watched Samson run and play as I sit at the picnic tables in the park. There were so many people out that day. I guess all the snow we have had this winter being melted, they all wanted to get out of their homes. I noticed from a distance an old man walking down the road across from me. He had to be in his 80s, and he looked really feeble and tired, and I wondered if I should go help him. He looked over at me and stopped, his long white hair blowing in the spring breeze. He began walking toward the park. I thought to myself, I hope he didn't think I was staring at him and has become offended. How could he have seen me? He must have good eyes. The old man eventually made it over and sat across from me at the table and stared at me for a while. I finally asked him how he was, and he replied that he had finished a lot of traveling and needed to sit down. He asked me if that was my dog. I replied it was and told him I have had him for almost 10 years. He began feeling around in the pockets of his old gray khakis like he was looking for something, and then he pulled out an old skeleton key. It looked like it was from the Victorian age and had a sparkling gem on it. The old man began to explain to me that it was a magic key and that it would fit any lock you put it in. He asked me if I wanted to look at it. I told him I would, and so I sit there looking at his antique key for a minute and reached over to hand it back to him. He then began asking, "You want this key, don't you?" I replied, "No, sir, I don't want your key." He kept insisting on it over and over. I thought the old man had flipped his lid. He then got violently desperate and said, "Please, sir, take this key from me and say you want it. But I don't want your key." I was beginning to feel a little insecure about this old man, and on his last attempt, I gave in to his pleas and said, "Yes, I want your key." He handed over the key to me and said, "By using this key and saying a date, you will enter through a gate. If you lose it on your way, there you will be and there you will stay." I chuckled at the man turning my head to check on Samson, and when I turned back, he had disappeared. All I saw was a young man enjoying a leisurely stroll on a spring day. Well, that was weird, I thought to myself. Maybe I just zoned out for a minute and the old man hobbled off. Who knows? All I know is he was gone and I had this antique key. Samson and I stayed for a few more minutes and then we got in the car and headed for home. When we had arrived home, Coop was still working on his building, and I tried the key on my door, and for sure it fits right in the keyhole and unlocked the door. I then tried it on every door in the house, and it fit them also. The old man wasn't lying and wasn't as much of a nut after all. I sat down at the kitchen table and drinking on some orange juice, I studied the key and thought back on what the man had said. By using this key and saying a date, you will enter through a gate. If you lose it on your way, there you will be and there you will stay. I repeated the phrase several times in my head and thought, what if the old guy is right? He was right about it fitting any lock. Maybe the man knew something I didn't or just didn't want to believe. I had to test it. I looked at Samson, and strangely, he had a twinkle in his eyes. I told him, "You stay here." So I stood up and headed for a door. Okay, just put the key in and say a year, and then take the key out and hold on to it. If the old man's phrase is correct, this key will allow me to go through a gate, whatever that could be. I put the key in the lock and turned it and said out loud, 8.D, 1492. And then I removed the key and put it in my pocket. Opening the door and walking through, I began to hear a loud, high-pitched squeal in my ears, and a blue smoke surrounded me. After going through, I discovered that I had just walked out of my back door into what looked like a hallway of some kind. I was dressed in the strangest 1400s attire. I had no idea how I became dressed in these clothes. I turned around and looked at the door I had just come out of. It come to me I had just walked out of a cabin room that was on a small ship. The ship looked to be about 100 feet long. I saw a man walking down the hall in my direction, and I asked him, "Good fellow, what ship is this?" The man replied, "The Santa Maria." I then said to myself, "Okay, 1492 and Santa Maria." I put the two together and realized I was on one of the 3 ships of Christopher Columbus's first expedition. I walked down the hallway, and I overheard a group of the men plotting to throw Mr. Columbus overboard and turn the ships around. They had become weary after 5 weeks of ocean sailing and were about to kill the founder of the New World. Oh no. I thought to myself, I have to keep this man alive. I asked one of the men if he had the current date and time. He looked at me as if he thought I was crazy. I said, "Come on, man. I have fallen and I hit my head, and I don't feel like myself, and this long voyage has gotten the best of me. Please tell me what the date and time are." The man replied, "It's around 1:30 a.m. October 12th, 1492. I knew I had to keep Mr. Columbus alive for another half an hour, and then these explorers would discover the island we now know as the Bahamas, and they would lose their wrath for Mr. Columbus in exchange for excitement. By this time, they had made their minds up to throw Christopher overboard. I then stood up on a chair and made this announcement. "Men of the ocean, I am not a part of your expedition. I am a stowaway that is ridden with you on your ship free of charge and work to pay any compensation back to you. I also have brought not one woman with me on my free voyage, but 2 inch. I knew what I had said would take away any anger they have for Mr. Columbus for a while, and these guys would want to kill me instead. Bringing a woman on a voyage like this in that day and time would be considered a curse upon the whole ship. I would say and do anything to keep myself in existence, even if it meant dying doing it. If Mr. Columbus didn't live to discover something on this first expedition, I knew there was a chance I would not be born. The men were filled with indignation towards me for what I had said and began chasing me from one end of the ship to the other. It was a game of cat and mouse, and I was having a blast. It reminded me of some of the old Looney Tune cartoons. I went into one cabin, and it was Christopher's room. He raised up in his bed and asked, "What in the name of the Queen is going on?" I told him, "Your crew has plotted to kill you by throwing you overboard and planned to turn these ships around and head back to Spain." He asked me, "Who are you, stranger?" I told him I was his guardian angel and he better get himself to the top of the ship, that land would be discovered soon. He asked how I knew, and I said, "Just shut up, mate, and get up there." By this time, the gang of angry seamen busted through the door of their leader and had surrounded me. I picked up a sword and began trying to sword play with them and made myself look crazier than I already felt. I cut a big Z on Mr. Columbus's canopy he had over his bed in honor of one of my heroes, and I ran toward his window. I jumped out and landed on the side deck of the ship. The men looked out at me, shooting their guns and swearing at me and screaming, "You're dead, and your women will die too." I then got up and was in wretched pain from the fall. The men had made it to the deck also. We played chase, and moving toward the stern, I heard some of the men call out to the other two ships to come over and help kill the stowaway. I knew my goose was cooked, and finally, I heard what I was longing to hear. Someone from the ship Pinta yelled, "Land," and all the men lost interest in killing me and began to celebrate with cheer. Christopher Columbus was their hero again, and I staggered to the nearest door, and putting my key in the lock, I said, "A.D. 1775, and entered, being aware to hold the key. The piercing sound I had heard the first time I traveled rang in my ears once more, and the blue mist enveloped me. When coming out of the door, I was standing in what looked like a field of a large farm. Turning around, I saw I had just come out of an outhouse. I thought to myself, I wonder if I used that thing? I convinced myself not to go back in and see. The outhouse was just used by the key as a portal to get me to 1775. I did come out dressed for the times like what had happened in 1492, but this time I looked very colonial. I had no idea where I was, but I did know it was very dark and it was late in the evening. If it wasn't for the moon being out that night, I would have never been able to walk the small dirt road I had managed to find. I kept walking, trying to find a town of some kind, when I noticed a horse rider in a distance coming toward me. The horse rider kept getting closer and closer, and finally the rider saw me and stopped and yelled out, "Identify yourself." I told him my name and that I meant no harm to anyone and that I had traveled. He asked me if I was loyal to the king or if I was with the rebellion. I told him I was with the rebellion and I had no loyalty whatsoever to a king. I asked the man his name, and he said Paul Revere. I thought to myself, I can't believe I am standing in front of one of the greatest heroes of the Revolutionary War. I asked Mr. Revere why he was out so late himself, and if he had been traveling. He told me he had been instructed by Dr. Joseph Warren to ride from Boston to Lexington to warn John Hancock and Samuel Adams of the movements of the British Army, which was beginning a march from Boston to Lexington, to arrest Hancock and Adams and to seize the weapons being compiled at Concord. I was astounded by what he said, and I looked at him and said, "Well, good friend, you better be off on your mission, and that the future of our nation depends on him." He agreed he should be off and began riding through the night. I yelled, "Good luck," and soon he was out of my sight. I walked for the rest of the night and eventually made it to Lexington. Looking around, I hoped to spot a few of the American founding fathers. I didn't see any of them, but I felt really proud, and to actually see their efforts to become a sovereign constitutional republic was exciting. I talked with a man that was brushing on his horse, and he said that all things went well last night, and the colonies had come very close to defeat, but had miraculously scored a victory against the greatest nation on earth. I looked at him and said, "Sir, the outcome of this war will create the greatest country on earth, and nobody will stop it." He agreed, but really had no understanding of what it meant that I was saying. I then told him to have a good day and went into a local store just a little way down the road and bought myself a piece of horehound candy. As I was leaving the store, I pulled out my key and put it into the lock from the inside and said, "ID 1865." Holding my ears to try to quiet down the horrible loud noise I knew was coming, and looked for the blue mist I had become accustomed to seeing when traveling. I stepped out the door and onto a street, and there were people going to and fro on a busy night. I noticed several men dressed in fancy suits leaning against a building in front of me, smoking pipes and cigars. I then heard a voice coming from behind me saying, "Are you going to pay me or not?" I turned around and it dawned on me I had just gotten out of a stagecoach and the driver was waiting on the money I owed him for the trip. I nervously said, "Yes, sir," and reached into my fancy 1800 suit I was wearing, and sure enough, I handed the man a seated Liberty $50 and said, "Keep the change, old chap." He answered by saying, "Well, thank you, and if you ever need another ride, please see me first." I stood on the sidewalk and looked at the building I was in front of and wondered if I am here for a reason and if I should go in. I went toward the door and entered in, and a man asked me for my ticket, and if I didn't have a ticket, the charge was 10 cents. He also said the show had already started. I reached into my overcoat and found a ticket and handed it over to him without even looking at it. I could hear people laughing, and I thought the show must be good. I entered the theater and found an empty seat near the door. I was at a play, and it seemed really funny. Everybody seemed to have a good time. I wondered what play I was watching, and I reached and pulled out half of the ticket master had handed back to me. I looked, and it said April 14th, 1865, Our American Cousin. I knew then I was at the Ford Theater on the night of President Abraham Lincoln's assassination, and I had come late. I looked up at the presidential box, and there was President Lincoln with his wife Mary Todd Lincoln beside him, and he had a smile on his face enjoying the show. I had never seen the president smile in his photos, but he was really into the play that night. I watched him for what seemed like minutes, but could only have been seconds, and then I saw a ghostly dark figure come up from behind him. I jumped up in my seat very desperately, trying to stop the assassination from taking place, and yelled, "Behind you, Mr. President," and the gun went off. The president fell forward lifeless. The assassin then wrestled someone that looked like Major Henry Rathbone, and then he leaped out of the presidential box. It was John Wilkes Booth, the actor. As Booth leaped from the presidential box, he caught the spur of his boot onto the American flag draped in front of the box, and he hurt his right leg as he landed on the stage. He raised up what looked to be a knife and yelled out at the crowd, "Sic semper tyrannis." He then called out, "Virginia has been avenged," and ran for the stage door exit. The crowd then went into hysteria, and I tried to run toward the stage to grab Booth before he got away. The audience slowing me down, I shoved my way through and made it to the stage and went out the door that Booth fled out of. It led outside to an alley of the Ford Theater. I saw Booth getting on a horse and his horse handler there with him. I screamed, "Stop!" and he turned around and looked at me began while riding off. I gave chase and was doing pretty good at catching up with him, and then I was attacked and forced to the ground by an angry mob of men. I said to them, "I have to stop John Wilkes Booth before he gets away so he can be brought to justice." And one of the men said, "Mr. Booth won't get away, and you won't either." They thought I was running with him and not after him, and that I had conspired with him in shooting the president. They beat me while dragging me to the nearest jail, and I saw them taking President Lincoln across the street from the theater. I noticed his doctor following behind, and I pointed at the doctor and said, "Don't be probing into the wound for the bullet and causing more damage to the president." He pulled his medical bag up toward his chest like he was saying, "How did you know what I was going to do?" The angry posse shoved me violently into the jail cell, and I tried arguing my case that I was after Booth and not with him, and it fell on deaf ears. I stood there in that cold cell wondering why I couldn't do anything to help the president, and thought, why couldn't I have made it to the theater earlier? I looked into a mirror that had been put in there for prisoners to use to shave. I had aged by about 20 years. I realized that time travel was causing me to age, and that just a few more journeys and I would be an old man. I stood there thinking maybe I can go back and try again and save the president and change the way this has all happened. I thought for a minute while being spit upon and cursed by the cell guard. I made my mind up I would try again and walked toward the cell door. I looked at the guard and said, "You pathetic loser, you can't hold me," and then slipped the key into the lock and said AD 1865. I stepped out the door and onto a street, and there were people going to and from on a busy night. I noticed the same men dressed in fancy suits leaning against the building in front of me. I then heard a voice coming from behind me saying, "Are you going to pay me or not?" I turned around dazed. It dawned on me I had just gotten out of the same stagecoach again, and the driver was waiting on his money. I anxiously said, "Yes, sir," and reached into my suit and handed the man the seated Liberty $50 and said, "Keep the change." He answered by saying, "Well, thank you, and if you ever need another ride, please see me first." I stood on the sidewalk looking at the building in front of me and knew I was here for a reason and that I had to go in. I went toward the door and entered in, and the man asked me for my ticket, and if I didn't have a ticket, the charge was 10 cents. He also said the show had already started. I reached into my overcoat and found a ticket and handed it over to him and looked at it and began to cry. Then falling to my knees, I said, "I can't stop it. It's all happening the same as before. It's like it's set in stone." The Ticketmaster called on security, and I heard the president get assassinated again. The sound of that gun made me crazy, and I stood up and began beating my chest and screamed, "This key is a curse on me," and ran for the door. I put the key into the lock and cried out AD 1876 and left that nightmare and vowed never to return. After I had entered the door, I raised up out of a suitcase dressed in Indian regalia in the middle of a dusty field. I noticed there was a damaged stagecoach that had been wrecked and left to rot in a gully, and the suitcase had been emptied of all contents and used by the key as a portal to get me to 1876. It felt like it was summertime, and this type of weather was just what I needed after what I had been through when in 1865. I walked for a bit, and coming to a few trees, I made my way through them, and looking up, I saw the largest Indian army I believe could have ever existed. The Indians had captured a cavalryman, and I asked the man who the Indian leader was directly in front of me and what the day's date was. He whimpered out, "Chief Crazy Horse, June 24th, 1876, and a numb feeling shot from my feet all the way to my head. I began saying in my head, think fast, or Crazy Horse will be wearing your hair home today." Chief Crazy Horse raised his rifle and yelled at me and then asked, "Who are you?" I then took a step forward and said, "My name is Eugene that wiggles on the ground, and I have been sent by the yellow lightning to tell you that the son of the morning star will make a critical error when attacking the Lakota and Northern Cheyenne camp tomorrow." I explained to him, "Longhair has been told there are only 800 of you when in reality there are nearly 2,000 warriors with you, and he will split his 12 companies into 3 battalions and will attack around 12 p.m. Eugene that wiggles on the ground have seen this, and now I make it known to you." Chief Crazy Horse raised his rifle in the air and fired 3 continuous shots and said, "Thank you, Eugene that wiggles on the ground, for sharing your insight with me. We will be waiting on Longhair and will defeat him." He then told me I could go, and boy was I relieved. I didn't like Custer anyway and never looked at him as a hero as some make he is. When you attack Native American tribes at dawn while they are sleeping, to me that is not much of a hero, and I knew that was how he had gotten his Son of the Morning Star title. I walked to the nearest American fort named Fort Thomas. I was stopped by one of the soldiers and asked who I was. I told him I was the Eugene that wiggles in the mud, and that's all he needed to know, and kept walking. He said he would report me to Captain Benteen. I found this as an opportunity in helping Chief Crazy Horse again and replied to him, "You tell Captain Benteen when he gets out and receives an order from Custer for help to make sure he waits on the packs." Knowing all well Captain Benteen has been criticized for not going to Custer's aid because he felt he should wait on more ammo. The soldier got off his horse and began walking toward me, and I headed for a warehouse building. As I was putting the key into the lock, he grabbed me on my shoulder, and I said, "ID 1934, and I guess I disappeared right in front of him. He couldn't go with me because I alone owned the key. When I had passed through the gate, I found myself bumping into someone in front of me while walking out a door. I begged the man's pardon, and he told me to watch where you're going next time, old timer. I laughed and said, "Yes, sir, young whippersnapper." Then I exited the building and found it was dark, and I realized I was leaving a theater. It was cold in there, and I had read the sign on the wall which said, "Iced air," and I could believe it because it was freezing. I wondered what the movie was, and looking up at the neon marquee outside, I found it read Manhattan Melodrama. I thought to myself, the key has taken me to the shooting of John Dillinger, the bank robber, and any second now Agent Purvis is going to call out Dillinger's name, and Dillinger will begin to run a figure 8 in the road in front of the theater. He will then head off down an alley just to the left of the theater and then be shot and killed. Soon as I got the thought finished in my head, it all happened. There was nothing I could have done to save Dillinger. The key had brought me just as the event was about to happen, and what could I have done anyway? FBI agents were everywhere. I turned around and headed back inside the theater and went toward the restrooms. I pulled out my key and put it in the door and said AD 1941. I came out into a wonderful paradise of tropical plants and diverse flowers. I thought that the key finally had taken me into a place I could enjoy. I knew it had to be Hawaii, and I turned and looked at what I had just come out of. It was a Navy watchtower, and nobody was in it, So I went back and began looking around. I noticed a mirror on the wall and found I had aged drastically. I must have been nearly 70 years old, but that was nothing because I felt I had been slapped with a ton of bricks when I saw the date on the calendar that was hanging on the wall. It read December 7th, 1941. I looked for a clock and I found a regulator just across from the calendar, and the time was 7:50 a.m. I knew then it was Pearl Harbor Day, and the Japanese Empire would attack Pearl Harbor in just 5 minutes. I had to find a radio, and I found one as I walked through the office on a desk. I cut it on and began calling out hello. Hello? Can anybody hear me? Finally, a man spoke and asked me who I was. I told him I was just a citizen, but that I knew that the Japanese would be attacking Pearl Harbor in a matter of minutes, and that he needed to warn somebody. He didn't believe me, and we wasted precious minutes going through who I was and my location. I then soon heard the planes as they arrived and the bombs exploding. Once again, the key had brought me too late to do anything to change an important event. Why? I walked toward the door and put the key into the lock. I said AD 1963 and left that tragedy behind. When I had stepped through the door, I found myself coming out of a library on a warm day. I made a left and began walking up the street some. I wondered if there was going to be a parade or something. People were accumulating to see something. I walked for a few minutes and noticed more people had arrived, and some with their children. I asked one lady what was the celebration about, and she replied, "Have you been hiding under a rock?" Then she explained the president is making a drive-through today. What? I replied, "Do you mean the president of the United States is making a drive down that road today?" She exclaimed, "Yes, President Kennedy. Isn't it exciting? He will be coming down that street any minute now." "You better believe it, lady," I said. I stood there shocked at what was going on, and I heard people beginning to cheer. I then saw the motorcade coming and President Kennedy waving and smiling at his supporters. I began to run with the motorcade and began motioning at the president and said, get down, Mr. President. Please," and he acted like he didn't hear me. I then watched in the gloom as the shots were fired and the president was dead. It all happened in slow motion to me. I began screaming in terror and began to run. I noticed a small child crying because his mommy had fainted because of what she had just seen. I went over to the child and comforted him and told him mommy is just asleep and everything will be okay. I picked up a returnable bottle of soda I found next to the fainted woman and dabbed a little on her forehead, and she awoke and grabbed up her child and squeezed him to her. I headed toward the city, and I saw Lee Harvey Oswald standing propped against a building. I ran to him and grabbed him by his shirt and began yelling, "Did you do it? Did you do it?" He replied, "Do what?" And I said, "Shoot the president." He shoved me to the sidewalk and said some Russian dialect I didn't understand, and then said, "Leave me alone, old man." I looked at him directly in his empty eyes and said, "I'll leave you alone, but you better be on the lookout for Jack Ruby." He snickered and said, "I'm not worried about Jack." I replied, "You better be." I wanted to see this man live and hope it would change the outcome of this mess and find out what really happened. I raised myself up and walked some, thinking about the key and how it was a curse. Yes, I had seen some amazing things, but I was powerless in the past. I felt I could travel a couple more times and still be okay. I looked to be about 72 years old, but was still spry and feisty to be old. I went forward to a shoe shop and put my key into the lock and opened the door and said AD 2064 and left the past to the past The future was calling. I stepped in and found myself in a room where the blue smoke lingered longer than usual. I walked further into the room and saw an old man sitting on the edge of a bed. He looked very tired and rough. I thought, now here's a man who looks like his life has been full of adventure and can tell a story or two. I approached him, and he looked up at me with tobacco spit running down his chin and said, "Well, you made it, didn't you, son?" I replied, "Yes, I did." The man asked me if I had had a good adventure. I told him it has been fascinating and scary at the same time. He told me that magic has worked in his life also many times. I told him I had magic and it had been given to me. He looked at me with his gums shining with his big smile and said, "You have no magic, boy." I said, "Well, then explain what has happened to me." He spit in a small cup and told me I was just a stupid man and that the magic was someone in my life. I asked, "Who then?" And he repeated, "Yes, the magic is in something your life. Any magic that has affected you is because of that." I found this old man to be very wise and full of information. We talked for a minute or so, and I finally asked him, "Who are you, sir?" And he looked and said, "I'm you." I went numb, and my heart felt like it was going to fly out of my chest. He began to laugh. He then asked how Samson was and said Samson was a special dog and to take very good care of him. I told him how much I appreciated the insight into the magic and that I'd better be getting back home. He looked at me and said he was tired and that he would be taking a long nap after I left, and then he began to lay down. I started to walk toward the door, and then he sat up quickly and asked me how Cooper was. I replied to him. When I had left, Coop was building that shed he always talked about building. I told the old loony man goodbye and began to head for the door again. The old man stopped me and asked me one more very off-the-wall question. He asked, "Do you remember the name of that old movie Raquel Welch starred in?" He said, "She played a cave girl." I said, "Yes, very much so. It's called 1,000,000 Years BC. The old man looked at me with stars in his eyes and said, "Yes, son, that is the name of that movie." I began heading toward the door thinking that I was a little more senile than I had first thought, and putting my key into the door, I spoke, "ID 2010," and headed for home. When I stepped through the door back into my house, Samson was still in the very same spot I first had left him. I had only been gone a few seconds, and he hadn't even had time to move. I picked him up and said, "All this time, boy, you have been waiting," and I hugged him and petted him for a while. It seemed like a long time to me, and I asked him if he wanted to go outside. I then realized I needed to disguise myself because I looked to be about 85 years old now, and I knew the neighborhood would notice. I put on a coat and a hood over my head and dark sunglasses and gloves over my hands, and then I took Samson out to the yard. Coop asked me what was wrong with me, and I told him I wasn't feeling too well and that I had bundled up just in case. He said that he hoped I didn't have anything contagious that he could catch, and I told him I didn't think so. Coop then began cursing and swearing over something. He said he had just put his door on his building and locked it, and his keys were in his building. I told him I had something that he needed. Then I began to explain that I had a universal key that can open any lock no matter what brand or kind. He asked me if he could use it, and I said, "No, you can have it." I asked him, "Do you want this key, Cooper?" And Cooper replied, "Yes, I want that key." I handed him the key and instantly became my original age. I pulled the hood off my head and Cooper headed for the door to his building. He then inserted the key into his door lock and he said, "Well, it does work, doesn't it?" I told him yes. He began to enter the door and I stopped him and asked, "Coop, one more thing before you go." I then said, "Do you remember what the movie is called that Raquel Welch starred in when she played a cave girl?" Coop said 1,000,000 years B.C. and then entered in, leaving his key in the lock. I then began to ask, "Coop, are you there?" And he didn't answer. I then smiled, thinking about what the old Eugene had asked me, and looked at Samson and told him he could use the bathroom in peace now. He did, and we went back inside the house. I could hear the older me laughing. He had shown me a way to get rid of Cooper and the key, save my dog and the neighborhood of a lot of future pain. Days went by, and nobody ever missed co-op. No family and no friends ever checked in on him. Alice came by once, and finally, they sold his house before it began to fall in. The key belonged to Coop now, but he wasn't here to use it. I went over one morning and took the key out of the building door before they sold his house. I put it away up in the vault in my attic. Well, Cooper won't be using it. Not in 1,000,000 years, I thought to myself. Well, that's my story. You can choose to believe it or not. Either way, I know without a shadow of a doubt I traveled through time, and the things I saw will stick with me all the remaining days of my life. Before I go, you may be asking, well, where did the magic come from? My answer is, the magic was in Samson. Samson was the magic. The end. 2010 by Eugene, Mathena. May not be used or distributed in any form without express written permission from the owner. Sharing is always permitted.